Over to Anne-Marie Hunter.
Hi everybody, I'm Anne-Marie Hunter from Safe Haven's Interfaith Partnership Against Domestic Violence. So we're here in Boston. I'm here with my colleague Sharina Krambashar, and we're both here, and we're looking forward to this webinar. At Safe Havens, we know that all survivors are not faith affiliated, but for those who are faith affiliated, faith can be central to their identity and their decision making and their healing. And we recognize also the tremendous diversity of faith and culture across the United States. And we know, too, that advocates are called upon to provide services to survivors across many faiths and cultures.
To help advocates build capacity to serve survivors from many backgrounds, Safe Havens put together a series of 8 webinars that look at domestic violence through the lens of various religious and cultural traditions. Today's webinar is the third in this series. If you missed the first 2, no worries. They were recorded and are posted on the Safe Havens website at www.interfaithpartners.org. The next webinar is Wednesday, April 19, when we'll look at abuse through the lens of victims who are affiliated with the Christian community. We've also included webinars that focus on the African American and Latina communities. We'll also provide webinars that explore the issues special to victims of clergy abuse and elder abuse. The complete webinar schedule will be at the end of today's presentation.
Our work is funded by the Office on Violence Against Women at the Department of Justice, and we wanted to take just a moment to thank them for providing resources for this important work, and especially to thank our grant manager, Charlotte Turpin. Today we're exploring abuse through the lens of Islam and Muslim Americans, and we have a world-class expert from Peaceful Families Project here to guide us. It's a tremendous honor to introduce Salma Abugideiri to you. Salma Abugideiri is a founding board member of the Peaceful Families Project, and the organization itself is dedicated to educating the Muslim community leaders and members about domestic violence. Salma provides educational workshops. She develops resources related to mental health issues and domestic violence among Muslims, as well as workshops on healthy relationships. And she also finds time to write. She's a contributing author to several books, including Counseling Muslims, Handbook of Mental Health Issues and Interventions, and Change from Within, Diverse Perspectives on Domestic Violence in Muslim Communities. She's also co-authored a brief guide for helping professionals entitled What Islam Says About Domestic Violence, which I highly recommend to all of you. And she has also co-authored Before You Tie the Knot, a guide for couples.
Salma is a licensed professional counselor in Northern Virginia. She provides individual and family therapy for a wide range of mental health and relationship issues. She has worked extensively with Middle Eastern and Muslim families. Salma also provides training to imams, faith leaders, and the wider community.
Safe Havens has partnered with Salma and with Peaceful Families in many ways over many years. And I've also personally participated in a Peaceful Families training, so I can absolutely guarantee that we're in for a treat today. The agency is a national leader in work at the intersection of faith and abuse, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Salma to you, and we are deeply grateful, Salma, that you have agreed to join us, and we will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. I'm listening to you introduce me, and I feel really humbled and very honored. I'm always happy to do work with Safe Havens because of the wonderful work that you've done in building bridges with clergy and interfaith communities. So I'm really happy to be part of this program. I'm just going to go through the presentation, and I'll be stopping at certain points to take questions, which you can type into the chat box, but I will just tell you up front that I won't be reading those because I can't speak and read and talk all at the same time. So in order for me to not get tongue-tied, I'll focus on the presentation. I'll pause and take questions. And Alicia, if anybody has a question about something that I've said that isn't making sense in that moment, please interrupt me, and I'll be happy to answer that. So let's start by just getting on the same page in terms of who we're talking about. I'm going to be trying to give you some insight on working with the Muslim population in the United States. And so we'll just start by defining our population. Who are the Muslims? Of course, Muslims are the group of people that people, whether you were interested or not, you're hearing about Muslims in the news all the time, not always great. But people have different definitions and understandings, so we'll just get on the same page here. Muslim is an Arabic word, and it literally means one who submits to the will of God. And so a Muslim is a person who follows the religion of Islam, and the word Islam is also an Arabic word, and it comes from the root word in Arabic, which means peace. Muslims come from all over the world, and according to a recent Pew study, there are 3.3 million Muslims in the United States, which is approximately 1 to 2% of the population, just depending on who's counting and how they're counting. And this number is estimated to double by the year 2050. Of all the Muslims in the world, only 20% are Arab, and so that's often a misconception that people have. People assume that Arabs are Muslims and Muslims are Arab, but actually, while the majority of Arabs are Muslim, the majority of Muslims are not Arab. The largest populations of Muslims are in Indonesia, Pakistan, India, and there are really sizable numbers of Muslims in China, Russia, and then in Western countries as well. So just kind of briefly to give you a little bit of background about what the religion is, and this is not meant to be kind of religious education, but really just to help people understand, if you're not already familiar, with, what is it that Muslims believe? Because many of you are working in communities where you are serving Muslims as part of your clientele, and it may not always be appropriate to ask people, what their beliefs are. So it's helpful to have a little bit of an idea. So the religion of Islam is a monotheistic religion, and Muslims view Islam as a continuation of the monotheistic tradition that began with Abraham. And so many of the teachings in Islam are actually similar teachings that are found in Judaism and Christianity, particularly related to values, what's really important in our life. So there's a concept in Islam that human beings were created to worship God and to be his representatives on earth, to be stewards on the earth. And there's an important teaching in Islam about accountability, which I highlight when I'm talking about domestic violence, because that's something that is really useful in domestic violence prevention and addressing things like victim blaming, that from the religious perspective, each person is accountable for their own behavior. And the perpetrator, may tend to blame the victim, but in actuality, that doesn't resonate from the religious perspective. There's also an important concept about freedom of choice. And again, this is really important when we work with both victims and perpetrators, that we are all given the right to choose how we behave. And in the Islamic context, and this is true in other religions as well, that while we are going to make our own choices in this world, there is a day of judgment for final accountability and reckoning. And Muslims also have a concept of a hereafter. So where there is either eternal reward in paradise or eternal punishment. And that can be helpful sometimes for survivors in particular if they haven't been able to find justice through the legal system, which, as many of you know, is wonderful and can also sometimes be flawed. So knowing that there will be a day when there is ultimate justice can be very helpful for survivors. I think this slide just got out of order, but this is just a map of what I was saying earlier in terms of the majority of Muslims not being Arab. We often talk about and associate Muslims with the Middle East, but the Middle East is also not only an Arab region. There are important and large countries like Turkey, Iran, Israel, depending on who's defining the Middle East, because the definition changes. It's a definition that comes from the State Department, and it can change. But there are, countries like Sudan and Ethiopia, Somalia, and each of these countries has very, very different cultures. So while the majority of people from this region may be Muslim, you can just take a look at all the different countries and recognize that there will be tremendous diversity with people, even if they're coming just from this region of the world, and Muslims are not only coming from this region. So one of the challenges in working with Muslims and trying to learn about this population is that it is incredibly diverse. So let's talk for a little bit about Muslims in the United States. So Muslims come from, in the United States, over 80 different countries. And obviously each of those countries, as I just said, has their own culture, can have their own language, and so definitely not a monolithic group. The breakdown in the United States is roughly about a third, and you'll find other studies that may say a fourth of the Muslims being from South Central Asia. So we're talking about countries like Pakistan, India, Bangladesh. Another 25% or 30% come from the Arab countries. Right now, of course, we have a lot of, have had a lot of refugees coming in from war-torn countries. About a third of the Muslim population in the United States is African American. Some of these are converts, and some of them have been Muslims for generations. And we know that in the United States, some of the earliest Muslims came with Columbus, and his cartographer actually was Muslim. And then about 70% of the slaves that came to the United States, that were brought to the United States, were Muslim as well, even though the slave owners tried to eradicate their religion. Some of them managed to hold on to it, and others did not. But the roots of Muslims go back pretty far in this country. So as you can see from these pictures, and these are just a few of the pictures I could have chosen, but just wanted to kind of show you representation of the diversity of Muslims. And according to a Pew study in 2007, so it's a little bit dated now, but Muslim Americans are very diverse, middle class, and mostly mainstream. According to a Gallup poll around the same time, the faith community of Muslims is the most diverse faith community in the United States. So that's wonderful. There's a lot of richness, and it can be challenging for advocates who are trying to understand, have a better understanding of this population. So as I talk, I'm going to try to give you good information, but also I want you to remember that because of the diversity, generalizations are just that. They're generalizations and may or may not apply to your particular client or client family. In addition to the ethnic background and country of origin backgrounds that contribute to the diversity, even within a particular ethnic background or country of origin, there is a lot of diversity in the way that Islam is practiced, and that can be influenced by social status, by religious knowledge, by education, the type of cultural rituals that people have, even individual personality. So think about people that that are of any religion, Christian, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, and if you know more than one person from that faith background, or even think about in your family, then you'll know that even like personality can affect the way that religion is practiced. And so even in one family, you can have siblings who practice to varying degrees, or who might even, if you were to ask a question, what does your religion say about X, Y, or Z, two people in the same family may have a different answer. So just to bear in mind that Muslims are no different from any other faith community, in that type of diversity. And when I talked about education, that could be religious education, but it could also just be, secular education. So a person who's reading their scripture from, an educated scientific background is going to pick up on different things than, let's say, my background as a therapist. When I read the Quran, I'm reading it through my lens as a therapist, and so I focus on the verses that talk about relationships. Or if I'm, when I'm talking about domestic violence prevention, my reading is really trying to highlight and lift up those teachings that will help me in my domestic violence prevention. So people will read their scripture with different lenses, and so you may get different readings. Okay, let me just pause here. Any questions so far? Okay, looks like no. Okay, so I'll continue. Okay, so there are a lot of things that can affect survivors of domestic violence, and so there is that religious context. Then there's the intersection of the sociopolitical context and domestic violence. So people, in terms of how they may respond to the violence that they're experiencing, will also be thinking and considering other things. So the degree of Islamophobia, for example, currently is probably at the highest it's ever been. Post 9/11, there was a huge spike, and the number of hate crimes is on the rise now. But there's always been a negative portrayal of Muslims in the media. You can just think about some very, popular movies or popular TV shows, and typically if there's a Muslim in the show, the Muslim is a terrorist, a suicide bomber, or, at minimal, just kind of a bumbling idiot who can't speak English properly, or, it's just rarely are Muslims portrayed in a positive light. Not never, but rarely. And so even, when I was a child, I don't know what the age range of people on this program is, but, there was the I Dream of Jeannie show, for example. Jeannie pops out of a bottle, she's speaking supposedly in, some Middle Eastern language. And, so people have this sort of exoticized idea about Muslims. When I was growing up, it was not uncommon for kids to ask me if I had an oil well in my backyard, or if I had a camel in my driveway instead of a car. So these are all kind of notions that people have from their exposure, what they're seeing on TV. So that does affect people. If somebody is experiencing discrimination, or they might just be anxious that seeking help from a provider who hasn't had experience working with Muslims, they may worry that they'll be discriminated against, or that they simply will be misunderstood, or that they'll be looked at in a negative light. And Muslims have always considered, in seeking help, is this going to be something that will reflect more negatively on our community? So since as a group, Muslims have often been portrayed negatively, many people are just conscious about not adding to that by coming forward with a report about domestic violence, not wanting to add any more negativity to the way the community is portrayed. Of course, when I'm doing community awareness within the Muslim community, I educate people that domestic violence doesn't occur anymore in the Muslim community than in any other community. And if they were to seek help, they would actually see that there's quite a diverse range of people that are affected by domestic violence. It exists way beyond any faith community, as you all know. So post 9/11, there was, of course, as you know, a backlash against Muslims and Arabs, and unfortunately people who are not Muslim or Arab, but let's say Arabs who are Christian. There was a backlash against Sikhs and, people that just, the general public assumed were Muslims because they look brown or they look like they come from the Middle East or something like that. And of course, the current policies that are being put forward definitely will affect and are already affecting Muslims who may be considering whether or not to report domestic violence, whether or not to seek services from an agency for fear of, deportation. The most recent version of the Muslim ban does say that it does require a reporting of domestic violence, and there's the language of honor killing in that legislation by foreign nationals. So, while yes, we do want people to report any kind of domestic violence, that kind of language really puts a spotlight on Muslims and is definitely going to factor into people's decision making, whether or not they're going to seek help or not. Of course, at the international arena, there's also a lot that affects domestic violence survivors. Just if we even talk about the travel bans, this affects people in so many different ways. Families are getting fragmented, broken apart. People are getting stuck. Although, of course, the bans have been barred right now, but some damage has already been done. The ban on refugees coming into the country also means that people are going to be focused on some of these bigger and more what might feel to them like more painful issues, and they may not address the domestic violence that's happening in their home if they're feeling unsafe about the general society. It just may feel safer to stick with what's familiar, even if it's abusive, rather than step into what feels right now as very uncertain territory. Even Muslims who are American citizens, and that's pretty much really the bulk of Muslims in this country. As a therapist, I've had many families where they really theoretically don't need to be concerned about their safety, but people are concerned about their safety. There's so much anxiety, not just about traveling, but just about what's going to happen to Muslims. The talk of the Muslim registry is something that is affecting adults and children, and lots of family conversations happening. Parents are trying to figure out how to make their children feel safe. So with all of that as the backdrop, the domestic violence may not get the attention that it needs to get. So that's just something to keep in mind. There are lots of other factors as well that can affect domestic violence survivors. One is the immigration experience. So, there are layers in terms of what people are affected by. Some people may have had traumatic experiences just coming to this country, and maybe those traumatic experiences happened before they were in an abusive relationship. Maybe they happened while they were in an abusive relationship. Many people who have come to this country may have come here, seeking the American dream, and these are people who may have come here for professional studies and are actually, in the upper socioeconomic brackets in this country. And these people probably have had an easier time acculturating, and they may be more able to access services, and they may have less barriers, less obstacles to seeking service, and they may have less conflict about seeking services. people who have come here with a history of, maybe they were survivors of political persecution and torture. Maybe they experienced torture in refugee camps before they got here. These are people that will have underlying mental health issues, perhaps, as a result of those experiences, and they may be less likely to trust if they come from countries where, like a police state or a dictatorship. They may have a real fear of law enforcement, the court system, the legal system. And of course, these same systems that we may use to help survivors of domestic violence, those same systems are the ones that are responsible for, deporting people, enforcing any kind of federal laws or state laws. And so there can be some real conflicts. And, as advocates, we may not even be able to assure people right now that it is safe to seek services and that will not lead to deportation or some other kind of unintended legal consequence. Okay, so another layer to consider are acculturation issues. So, if you remember earlier in the presentation, I said that a big chunk of Muslims in this country come from South Asian countries or they come from Arab countries. And so, those groups that are coming with an immigration history are going to be may be struggling with some other issues. They're not necessarily going to be struggling, but they may be struggling with some other issues that can increase the level of stress in the family. And we know that stress doesn't cause domestic violence, but it certainly is a factor to consider. And some of those factors, if you look on this slide, it's the same thing that you might see in any immigrant population. If you're working with Latinos who are not Muslim, or because there are Latinos who are Muslim, but any immigrant group, they may be struggling with issues of being employed, and so a lot of times women are able to get jobs easier than men, and in those cases, if it's a traditional family, then that causes role reversal and can create a lot of challenge for men if they are and if they've been raised to be the primary breadwinners. And so now if they're dependent on their wives, then that does cause a lot of stress. It can cause some psychological issues. And in some cases, as a way to assert their role, that might be a trigger for domestic violence. Of course, there are many other issues that you'll be familiar with if you work with immigrant populations, the language barriers, the stereotypes that people face. I've already mentioned some regarding Muslims, but that, some of the common ones, and people ask me this all the time, like, why do Muslim men beat their wives? Why are so many Muslim women abused? Why are Muslims violent people? And, the question itself reflects a stereotype. So the other day I was doing a training for mental health therapists, and I was talking about, these stereotypes, and I just threw the question out to the audience. I said, why? So why do Muslim men beat their wives? And a woman in the audience who was white, she said the same reason that white men beat their wives. And I said, that's exactly right. And it's important that we don't get distracted by the, whether it's a different skin color, different ethnicity, or different faith community that people are coming from. It's important we don't get distracted by those superficial differences and forget that abuse occurs in every community basically for the same reasons. It's about power and control. So it's important not to get distracted by the stereotypes. The truth is that as a community, and there's plenty of research to bear this out, Muslims are no more violent than any other community, and the majority of violent, how do I want to language this? The majority of crimes that have been like these mass sort of mass violence, the majority of those kinds of crimes have not been committed by Muslims. I think only like 1 or 2%. But because the media frames these crimes as and sort of emphasizes the fact that the person committing the crime is Muslim, that sort of takes over. And the other crimes that are committed by people who are not Muslim, one, the perpetrator is generally not identified by their religion or their race or anything else, and so it just doesn't stick in our minds as much. And so these are ways that the discrimination and the Islamophobia can get perpetuated. And if we internalize those messages as advocates, then it can affect the way that we respond to the advocate. So domestic violence survivors who are Muslim are going to be affected by all of these things. And then, of course, you know, there are many other issues related to the sort of the legal immigration issues. And then the value conflicts, and what I mean here are things like, for example, the value of keeping family matters private. And so in many communities, not just Muslim communities, people are not interested in putting out their dirty laundry, so to speak. So that's one value, right, of keeping family matters private. And then there's another value of safety and well-being of, let's say, the children. And so I want to keep it private that we're having this major problem inside the home where, you know, the husband may be abusing his wife or vice versa. And how do I reconcile that value with, you know, as a mother or as a father, I want to keep my children safe, and I know that this environment is not good for my children. So that's a value conflict that any survivor could experience, not just a Muslim survivor. And I'll talk a little bit more as we go through about those things that might be particular to Muslims. Again, for the immigrant survivors, they are going to be dealing with multiple losses. And that's something that will also perhaps come into play if she's thinking about leaving the marriage. So if people have come from countries and societies where they were part of an extended family, and they came here and they lost that extended family support, and so now it's just a nuclear family, and that is a very different way of living for people who are coming from Eastern cultures and Eastern societies. So it's a lot of adjusting for the family to go from having aunts and uncles and grandparents and cousins, all of whom are maybe helping and taking care of the children and who might be providing support, and even if there's conflict between the husband and wife, or even if there's violence between the husband and wife, you know, family members might intervene and kind of calm down the situation. The family immigrates here, and it's just the husband and wife and the kids, and that may be the first time they've had to manage everything on their own. And so then the idea of, you know, if it's a female who's the one affected by the abuse, the idea that now she's going to become a single parent in a country where she has no other support is pretty overwhelming. And it may be so overwhelming that she just won't even consider it. In Muslim communities, the marital status is an important status, and there can be a lot of stigma around being a single parent. And sometimes the faith community becomes a surrogate extended family. And if the faith community is not open or accepting of single parents, then that's going to be very isolating for her. And so let me just say at this point that, again, there is a lot of diversity among Muslims and among different communities. So some communities are very conservative, and other communities are more, for lack of a better word, liberal or progressive. And the way that divorce or single parenthood or domestic violence, any of these things, the way that they're viewed is going to vary from community to community, from family to family. So I've talked about religion and culture, and I want to just clarify a little bit how these can intersect with each other. We are informed by many, many different value systems, our own individual family. If we are coming from a faith tradition, then our religion provides values that inform us about the world and how we want to live in the world. Whatever cultural background we come from also has values. And so all of these things come together and provide lenses through which we interact with the world. And some people may rely more on their cultural lens, some people may rely more on their religious lens, and sometimes these value systems contradict each other. So for example, if we were to take, something that most people are familiar with, the idea of divorce in American culture, it's fairly normal, fairly acceptable for people to get divorced. The rate of divorce is over 50%. And the stigma around divorce is really not that much anymore. If you happen to be Catholic and American, then you're informed not only by the American values, but by Catholic values. And in Catholicism, divorce is not acceptable. And so this is just one example of how your religious values and your cultural values could contradict each other. And so a Catholic American woman is going to have to go through a process of deciding which of these value systems she's going to follow, which one is going to inform her as she's trying to figure out what to do with the abusive relationship. And for Muslims, if we take that same exact issue of divorce, it's kind of the flip of what a Catholic American woman may be experiencing. So in many of the Eastern cultures, in Arab culture, in South Asian culture, divorce actually is not acceptable. That's changing, but there's still a lot of stigma around divorce. And in some cultures, some families will view divorce as something that's like a contagious disease. So a woman who's divorced may not be included in weddings. She may be sort of kept separate from the unmarried girls in the family, because there's a fear that these girls won't get married if people know that they're related to somebody who's divorced. So it could be that severe. But the religion of Islam considers divorce as a peaceful option when people are not able to treat each other well in a marriage. So it doesn't even have to be an abusive situation, but if the couple are not able to treat each other in a way that's mutually respectful, with love, with compassion, then they can let each other go. They can separate. And abuse is a legitimate grounds for divorce in Islam. And from the religious perspective, divorce is actually pretty easy and simple. So then an Arab woman, if she comes from a rural area, like a village in any Arab country where divorce is not acceptable, and she may feel that it's actually very shameful, even though an imam, the religious clergy for Muslims, if an imam were to tell her it's okay for you to get a divorce, from a religious perspective, she still might not feel like that's okay because she's been socialized to believe that there's a lot of shame around it. And even if it's an abusive situation, the women are often held responsible for the success or failure of a marriage, and that's actually true in American culture, unfortunately. That often happens too, where women are going to be blamed, or at least those questions can be asked that make it feel like women are being blamed. Any questions so far? Okay, I don't see any in the chat box, so I'll continue. Is there a question? Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you, Nancy. Okay, so I'll just continue, and I'll check the chat box periodically. So many people may wonder, why do we even need to consider religion? If we're helping somebody deal with domestic violence and we're trying to help her or him get to safety, and we're, seeking legal remedies, why is religion even something that we have to talk about? And the truth is that for many people, whether they are Muslim or not Muslim, particularly communities of color, religion can be an anchor, and it is something that can help people navigate uncertain territory, uncertain times. And so if let's say you're an immigrant, new to the country, everything is unfamiliar, you might feel kind of lost, your faith community and your faith traditions can give you a feeling of, being a little bit more grounded. Because regardless of where you are, you take those religious teachings with you, so that can be sort of a consistent part of your life. Many people, whether they were raised to be religious or not, might turn to religion in a time of crisis. And when people are trying to make these huge decisions of, what they should do with their relationship, should they go, should they stay, should they report, should they not, they may seek guidance from their faith tradition. And I've worked with many people over the years who may not have even thought of themselves as religious and may not have really relied on their religion much. But when they're trying to make a decision about divorce, they start to seek answers and guidance from their religious leaders, from the imams for Muslims, and they may for the first time start reading their scripture. So for Muslims, that's the Quran. So it's important that we recognize that people may be turning to their religion, not just to us as advocates for guidance. Religion can be very much intertwined with culture, as I mentioned before. And so it's also really important to recognize that as advocates, if people are using their religion as a resource, as an anchor, that can actually make our lives a little bit easier. And religion, in the best case scenarios, religion is a resource. And, a lot of times survivors, when they talk about their journey, when they reflect back, and I've heard this from survivors of all different faiths, not just Muslims, they look back and they're able to see the ways in which that they felt that God was actually with them, that God put people in their lives, including the advocates, to help them get through the nightmare. For Muslims, the concept of justice is extremely important, and injustice and all forms of oppression, including domestic violence, are not acceptable from a religious perspective. So for many victims, Muslim women who feel like maybe they can't utilize the legal system for whatever reason, they can still feel very comforted just knowing that God is a witness to what's happening and God hates what's happening. So it's important to, even if you yourself don't feel comfortable or don't want to bring religion into the conversation when you're working with advocates, it's important for you to know that it can be a source of support for victims. It's also really important when we work with clergy, we emphasize this, and Peaceful Families Project is doing a national imam training actually in about 10 days. And this is a point that we really emphasize with the imams, that holding perpetrators accountable is very consistent and congruent with Islamic teachings, and that religious leaders can play a very important role in holding perpetrators accountable. Whether it's, individually to the perpetrator, or whether it's, when they're giving a sermon, naming the perpetrator as the perpetrator, you know, when talking about domestic violence, that it's never the victim that's to blame for any kind of violence in the home, but it's the person who's raising their hand or cursing or you know, financially abusing or spiritually abusing. So just, you know, putting the blame where it belongs. In worst case scenarios, religion can be a roadblock, and many advocates actually try to avoid working with clergy and faith communities because they've had such negative experiences. You know, particularly if clergy have not been trained and they may not be working in a way that feels collaborative with advocates. They may be giving the survivors sort of pointing survivors in a different direction than the advocates would like in terms of, you know, whether seeking legal remedies, protective orders, things like that. And sometimes, you know, advocates have experienced where clergy may pressure the survivor to stay in the abusive relationship and you know, quote unquote, forgive the perpetrator. So we do a lot of education for clergy to understand that you know, forgiveness and leaving are not mutually exclusive. You can leave the marriage and you can forgive whenever you're ready to forgive, but what has to be first is safety. And then in abusive relationships where we're talking about people that come from a faith tradition, Muslims or Christians or Jews, a lot of times religious texts are taken out of context to justify the abuse. And so it is really, really important, again, not to get distracted. If you're working with a Muslim family and the victim or the perpetrator says something about the religion giving him a right to beat his wife or discipline his wife or whatever it is, it's really important not to get distracted by that and to remember that perpetrators of any background, by definition, are manipulative. They'll use whatever they can to justify their behavior and to let themselves off the hook, right? So perpetrators are great at blaming everyone else for their behavior. And Muslim perpetrators are no different in that than any other kind of perpetrator. But if you're not familiar with Muslims and you're not familiar with the religion of Islam, it could be really easy to just believe that because it fits with the stereotypes. But if we do that, then we're actually guilty of colluding with the perpetrator and falling into that manipulation. Okay, I do see a question here. Could you provide me with a contact for more info on the Imam training? You're actually welcome to just email me directly. Salma, S like Sam, A-L, M like Mary, A, at peacefulfamilies.org. And I could type that in later if you need me to do that. Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about what the religion of Islam teaches about family, and I think that's important. Oh, thanks, Anne-Marie, for putting my email in there. I think it's really important to talk a little bit about what the religion actually teaches, mostly because there is so much misunderstanding around what Islam teaches and because of the stereotypes. So if you were interested, and you were to open the Quran and read about relationships in the Quran, there are many verses that address the nature of the relationship in the family. And some of the important teachings are that men and women were created from a single soul, and so, you know, we use that teaching to emphasize the equality between genders, that both men and women were created to worship God. In other words, they're created for the same purpose, that men and women are equally accountable to God, and so, you know, a male perpetrator cannot blame, you know, the female victim for provoking him. He's responsible for his behavior, and if she's done anything that, you know, he doesn't like, she'll be held accountable as well, but it's not a reason to raise a hand on her. And then the core ingredients of marriage in the Quran are mercy, compassion, and the purpose of marriage is actually mutual tranquility. And so the verse in the Quran is actually quite beautiful. And so when we're doing community awareness, we really emphasize, what healthy relationships are supposed to look like from the Islamic perspective. And that's part of the work we do for domestic violence prevention. Now, what you have to remember is, just like not all Christians in the United States would probably be pleasing to Jesus. If Jesus could see all the Christians in the United States, I'm sure he would not feel that they're all following his teachings. Muslims also are not all really following their religion. And so we do have to make a distinction between, the religion and the way that people live it or practice it. We also have to remember that, there is the role of culture. And so if you were looking at family structure in Eastern cultures, so this could be, what's on this slide could be a Middle Eastern Muslim family. Traditional values place the father as the leader in the family, responsible for most of the decision making, the head of the household, is the primary breadwinner, ultimately is the disciplinarian, and is the one that deals with the public domain. So in some, and this is not true of all Muslim majority countries, but in some countries, there is more gender segregation. And so men would be the ones that deal with public affairs. They're dealing with everything that's kind of outside the home, and women are more responsible for things that are occurring in the home. That is not, again, I'm talking about so many different countries, so that's not true of all Muslim majority countries, but that is true in some of them. Now, from the Islamic perspective, the teaching in the Quran is that the male is responsible for financially providing for the family. And so that is a responsibility that falls on the husband, and women are not responsible for providing financially, although if there's a need, then they're encouraged to help, as partners in the family, but it's not their responsibility. Culturally, in Eastern families, the mother is going to be the, caretaker and nurturer. She may be expected to be flexible and accommodating. Her strength would be more of a quiet strength and enduring. Her kingdom is the home. And in many families, and this is true, this is true in American families as well, a lot of times the mom is a buffer between the kids and the father if the father is the disciplinarian. So, these are generalizations. I'm going to talk very briefly about the Muslim marriage contract, and this is actually a big topic that I can't do justice to. There is a resource that if this is something that is useful to you and relevant in your work, if you work with a lot of Muslims and these issues come up, then we do have a resource guide on our website. If you go to peacefulfamilies.org and you click on the resources tab and on the under publications, there is the Islamic marriage contract resource guide, and so that's much more in-depth. But I'm going to do a quick overview because I think it's really important if you're working with Muslim families to understand how domestic violence can be prevented, but also how some of the abuse happens in the context or around the marriage process. So in Islam, the marriage is a civil contract, and there are some conditions in order to make that a legitimate marriage from the religious point of view. Both parties must consent. And so for those of you who have dealt with cases of forced marriage, you know right then that that's not a religiously acceptable arrangement because both parties have to consent. So by definition, there's no acceptance in Islam of forced marriage. Part of the marriage contract is that there is a gift. In Arabic, the word is mahr. sometimes in English you see that as dowry, but I want to distinguish here that this gift, this mahr, is a gift that's given to the bride from the groom. Okay, it's different from the dowry that you are maybe familiar with in Indian culture, where the dowry is given to the groom. So in Islam, the dowry is given to the woman. It's something that has to be stipulated in the contract. It's generally money, but it doesn't have to be money. It can be deferred. So sometimes, you know, the groom will say, okay, the dowry is $10,000. He gives her $1,000, you know, at the time of the marriage, and we'll defer the remainder. She can ask for that remainder at any point in time. So he might say, you know, I'll give it to you in 10 years, or I'll give it to you in installments, or whatever it is. She has to agree to the terms. There do have to be two witnesses to the marriage. So the, you know, if you hear about secret marriages, or if you have, you know, a survivor who's saying that her marriage was done in secret and she was forced to the marriage and she didn't even get her dowry, you know that none of the criteria for the religious marriage were met then. The contract itself can be verbal or written. In our community awareness and when we work with clergy, we really emphasize that it should be a written contract. And most imams now in the United States will not perform a religious marriage contract unless or until the marriage license has been obtained from court. There are still, unfortunately, some imams that will do the religious marriage without the civil contract happening. And that, of course, can be problematic because there's no legal marriage. And so if there's abuse, or, you know, she's not going to have too many rights. The marriage has to be publicized. These are all conditions. And the contract, embedded in the contract, is language that says that, you know, they're getting married based on the teachings of the Quran and the Sunnah. The Sunnah basically refers to the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be on him, and we believe that the Prophet Muhammad basically was the living example of the Quranic teachings, and so we follow his example. So implicit in that is that abuse is a violation of the contract, because the teachings in the Quran and in the Sunnah are to treat each other with mutual respect, mutual love, mutual consultation, and that there should be no harm caused by one party to the other party. And then the marriage contract, and this is the way that it can be kind of a preventive tool, is that either party can put terms in the marriage contract. And so a lot of times, of course, we encourage women to use that tool. And so she can specify in the contract that, you know, the husband will facilitate her continued education, that she won't have to live with her in-laws. In some cultures, that's kind of expected that she would live with her in-laws. That the wife has the right to initiate the talaq, or divorce. Traditionally, the husband is the one that has that right to initiate this particular type of divorce. We have, in Islam, there are multiple types of divorce. And so, you know, again, there's a lot of details around this, but if this is something that's relevant in your work, please do, you know, look up the resource guide, and you can get more information. And you can always consult with an imam, and if you need help finding an imam in your community to consult with, I'm happy to do that, help you with that. So as I mentioned earlier, divorce is permissible in Islam. There are different kinds of divorce, and this form that's called talaq is initiated by the husband. If the husband won't grant it, then a judge or an imam can initiate the proceedings when there are grounds for divorce. So that in our context, we're talking about abuse. And in this, the reason that this is important is because in this form of divorce, the wife is entitled to financial maintenance. So she's going to get spousal support, and she will keep any gifts that she receives during the marriage. There is a 3-month waiting period, and generally that waiting period is in the same house unless there are safety issues. And the husband is responsible for supporting his kids. So we know, of course, in cases of domestic violence, a lot of times the issues are around, the perpetrator. If the perpetrator is the husband, then the perpetrator does not want, is not paying child support, and that's another form of abuse, is not fulfilling the rights of the wife either. This is another form of divorce in Islam. It's called khula, and it's basically the wife can initiate this form of divorce even when there are no grounds. So she wakes up in the morning and, say she just says, I just don't want to live with this guy anymore. She doesn't have to live with this guy anymore. She can initiate this form of divorce, and if there are no grounds, then she returns her marital gift, and she does not get any spousal support. Because there are no grounds. The husband has not mistreated her. He's fulfilled all his obligations, but she just doesn't want to be married to him anymore. So he's not obligated to support her, but he is always obligated to support the children. Okay, so I'm just looking to see if there are any questions, because those slides are kind of technical. Okay, do children often remain with the wife after the khula divorce? So child custody is, it really depends on how people pursue their divorce. So there are many, many people that will go through the court system, and they will, they'll come to a custody agreement, or they'll go through a custody battle, whichever it is, and the judge will often determine, custody. And so it depends on the state that people live in, I think, more than the form of divorce. Also, there are some couples that will not go through the court, unfortunately, for their divorce. They will simply get a religious divorce. In that case, if the imam is the one that's helping with the custody arrangement, it will depend on the imam. It depends on the age of the children. It depends on the circumstances. So generally, imams will look at the well-being of the children. So if the mom has been the primary caretaker, she generally will remain the primary caretaker, because a lot of times if the husband is the one that's, earning, then he's not going to be able to take care of the kids anyway because he's at work. There are cases where the imams might, they'll do things like shared custody, or after a certain age, the kids will go to the father. But, it's kind of case specific. And it doesn't matter. I don't think that the type of the divorce is as significant as, just a specific case. And if they're seeking the custody agreement through court or outside of court. No problem. Okay, so just want to reiterate here that there's really no room in Islamic teachings for domestic violence. All kinds of oppression and injustice are very strictly prohibited. However, because Muslims are human beings, just like all other human beings, domestic violence does occur, and it occurs across all ethnic groups of Muslims. There is still relatively low community awareness of the problem. I've been doing domestic violence prevention work now for about 20 years. I see a huge amount of progress in terms of communities talking about domestic violence. I see a lot more events initiated by, like Muslim student associations on college campuses, by mosques, community centers, where they're inviting people to come in and talk about domestic violence. but I think that still, compared to the general public, we still have a lot of work to do. So there's progress. There are some cultures, really this should say cultural values, that may exacerbate the occurrence of domestic violence. And that is not only in cultures that Muslims come from, but in American culture as well. So, you know, anybody who pays $12 or $15 or whatever it is to go see a movie where people are getting blown up on the screen, you know, we're paying money to support violence, and we may be watching music videos, and we may be, you know, doing all kinds of things that support violence and can encourage, you know, aggressive behavior as kind of accepted behavior. And the same is true in cultures that Muslims come from. And so it's just important not to excuse the violence because of culture, nor to blame the culture for the violence, but just to recognize that culture can have lots of contradictory values. And so, you know, as American advocates, we are all fighting to end domestic violence, and we want to see peaceful families. And at the same time, we know that in American culture there are plenty of relationships that are abusive. Okay. So just these are some generalizations, and it's really difficult to talk about such a diverse population without generalizing, even though generalizing isn't a good thing to do, but that's really the only way to teach this in a short amount of time. But most Muslims come from cultures, I'm talking about Eastern cultures, so these are the immigrant portion of Muslims in the United States, that value group needs over individual needs. And that's a big contrast with American society, where we value the individual. The individual takes priority over the family. And that can create conflict. So when we're working with a female survivor and we're asking her what she wants and what's good for her, she's going to be thinking what's good for my family. And when she's thinking what's good for my family, she might be thinking about her parents, her sisters, her children. She's not just thinking about, you know, the nuclear family. Her decision may have a ripple effect on many, many, many people that she's connected to. And she's going to be thinking about all of that. It's not just about what makes her happy as an individual. And so that's really important when you're helping people figure out what their best options are, that you remember that they may come from cultures where the group is more important than the individual. And that's not better or worse. It's different, and it's just something to keep in mind. And if you're working with adolescents, that's extremely important that we don't pull these adolescents in a direction where we're putting them in conflict with their family values. So if, you know, the family is saying, you know, you got to think about the family, that doesn't mean that we can't help people move towards safety. We just have to do that in a way that's more of a family systems approach than an individual focused approach. Muslims generally come from cultures that value marriage and intact families. So that means that if we're talking about the need to break up a family because of the violence, that, you know, there's going to be some internal conflict there. That honor and reputation are really important. Because of the focus on the group, if one person is in trouble, then that reflects poorly on the entire family. It reflects, you know, if you come from a clan or a tribe, it reflects poorly on the entire tribe. And so in you know, these societies, that is a way that people regulate behavior, by reminding people that, you know, if you fall off the track, then you're going to make the whole tribe look bad. You're going to make the whole clan look bad. And sometimes that really regulates people's behavior. But that can also it can work in a negative way too. If divorce has stigma attached to it, then a woman may say, well, I'm not going to get divorced because, you know, that might jeopardize my family's reputation. So, you know, making a lot of space for people to explore these value conflicts and to get to get assistance that's culturally sensitive and appropriate can really facilitate the decision making. Okay, so it's important to just remember that there could be exacerbating factors. I feel like my slides somehow got out of order, but that's okay. This is just a reminder, to look at the big picture, that that people are not only dealing with their domestic violence, but that there may be other exacerbating factors. Yeah, these are really out of order. Okay, let me just fast forward here because I've talked about a lot of these. Okay. So sometimes people ask me about, specific kinds of abuse among Muslims, and I think that the most important thing to remember is that abuse is about abuse, it's power and control, and so you're going to see all the usual types of abuse even when you work with Muslims. But sometimes there's like different flavors, like, it just might come in a different costume. So, things that are specific to immigrants are going to be related to their immigration or their status. In situations where a woman wants a divorce, and if her husband is withholding the talaq that we talked about earlier, the divorce, so she may have gotten the civil divorce in court, and she wants that religious divorce from him just for, peace of mind. And one of the ways that he can continue to kind of control her is by refusing to give that religious divorce. So we encourage women to go to their imams, because the imams can grant that religious divorce if their husbands won't, so that they're not being held hostage. Another form of abuse is when the perpetrator refuses to give her the marriage gift, the mahr. And so what we have found is in many states, the courts are upholding the marriage contract. So remember I said that the marriage contract is a civil contract. So if it's written, and we always encourage people to have, either use a template or to, have an attorney look at the contract to make sure that it's in line with public policy and it's written in a way that can be enforceable by the courts. Then we have seen many cases where the courts actually make the perpetrator give the wife her marriage gift, or the mahr. Because reputation is very important, in particularly, so for all Muslims, but then particularly in the immigrant community, a really painful kind of abuse is accusing her of immorality or promiscuity. There are also some etiquettes and some rulings kind of around sexual behavior even within a marriage. And so some of the sexual abuse basically manifests in forcing the wife to have sex in ways that are prohibited or at times that are prohibited. So for example, coming up at the end of May, we have the month of fasting, Ramadan, and during the month of fasting, during the day, we abstain from food, from water, any kind of drinks, from smoking, and also from any kind of intimate relationship, even between spouses, so until after sunset. So a perpetrator might make his wife, who's fasting, have sex with him. So even though they're married and there's nothing, not appropriate about sex with your husband, but she's now violating a religious prescription. And so that's a very painful form of abuse as well. Okay, I do see a question. Can you touch briefly on the hijab? You had included an earlier photo expressing that wearing it is a choice, not a compulsion. I feel like it's a common misconception that it's required of Muslim women. Yeah, thank you for bringing up this question. I always forget to talk about hijab. So hijab is an Arabic word, and it just means cover. And basically, in English we would say, a woman who's covering her hair will cover it with a scarf, And just like everything else, it's a choice. And that doesn't mean that it's not religiously required. So for example, we are required to pray 5 times a day. But it's my choice whether I abide by that requirement or I don't abide by that requirement. So many Muslims don't pray at all, and some pray 3 times or 1 time, but the religion says you pray 5 times. And so the choice is, whether to practice or not to practice a particular teaching. No human being can or should be forcing any kind of any part of religious practice. So there are perpetrators, who will interfere with their wife's religious practice. They won't let her pray, or they might beat her to make her pray. They might not let her wear hijab. If she wants to wear hijab, but he won't let her, or she doesn't want to wear hijab and he will force her. So it's the absence of choice that becomes the abusive factor, not the hijab in and of itself. It's being able to choose as a human being what and how I want to practice my religion.
Salma, sorry to interrupt. We have, just so you know, we have about 10 minutes left.
Okay. Thank you for the reminder. Let me just look at the slides that are left here. Okay. So there are Muslims that practice polygamy, which is having more than 1 wife, even though it's not legal here. And so that is, in and of itself, it's not abusive if it's practiced properly. But in this country, because it's illegal, the second wife is not ever going to have rights as a wife, and her children won't be recognized as legitimate children, and so therefore it becomes abusive for that reason. I keep trying to advance the slides with my laptop. I wonder why they don't go anywhere. Okay, so I talked about that already. Okay. So let me just move forward. This is just a reminder that, to keep the big picture in mind, and we've talked about all of these things. It is really important as an advocate, this last point here, that you focus on the safety and well-being of each member of the family, including the abuser. We often, focus on the survivor, and we forget that these children, if let's say it's the husband that's the perpetrator, those children are always going to have that father. And so it is really important to also do what we can, when we can, to, get the perpetrator into some sort of treatment. And not to forget that that's part of these kids' family as well. And the truth is that most women really aren't interested in ending the marriage. They just want to stop the abuse. But we have to educate them about the reality in terms of, the abuse stopping without any kind of intervention, as well as the psychological impact of children who are witnessing and experiencing abuse. Okay, I want to make sure that I don't leave out any questions. I do encourage all of you to reach out to the Muslim community. I've talked about that already. Just to reach out to the Muslim community, go to the mosque or the community centers and see if you can teach something about, what your organization offers, what services you provide. Have a meeting with the imam and see how you might work collaboratively, how you might support support his efforts to have peaceful families in the community. You can also work together with the mosque to get resources, material resources, financial donations, transportation. There may be volunteers that can help you with the clients that you're working with. Okay, I just have some resources there. So let me just stop here because I want to make sure there's questions, and also give an opportunity to Anne-Marie if you wanted to wrap up.
I will as soon as we're done with questions, Salma.
Okay. On the Muslim community response wheel, under use your religious authority, what is a khutbah? Great question. Khutbah is just an Arabic word for sermon. And so Muslims have congregational prayers on Friday. And on Fridays, it's mandatory for men to attend. And so it's actually an amazing opportunity because the imam has a captive audience. And so we encourage imams to use that opportunity to talk about healthy relationships and to talk about domestic violence and to let the community know that domestic violence is not acceptable in Islam. Any other questions? Well, I really appreciate this opportunity. I know that it's a lot of material that I went through really quickly. I think you'll have access to the PowerPoint, and you're welcome to email me with anything else that comes up. My email was up there earlier. You can also go to the Peaceful Families website to reach out to us if you need any help, and if you get stuck. You're trying to reach out to an imam, and you're getting stuck, we do provide that kind of technical assistance as well. So thank you so much for this opportunity.
And speaking from the Safe Havens point of view, I wanted to thank all of you for participating. This has been really, really helpful and informative. And Salma, I cannot thank you enough. I wanted to invite everyone to attend other webinars in the series, and they're on your screen now. You can register for these and take advantage of these. We have, as you know, already done 2, and this one as well. They'll all be recorded and posted on our website, which is Interfaith, F-A-I-T-H, partners with an S at the end.org. I'll put our contact information up here in just a second. Salma, I just can't thank you enough for your expertise. You are
you're
amazing.
So welcome.
Every time I listen to you, I learn bucket loads of information. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I wanted to thank also Alicia Lord at NCJFCJ and for their terrific TA to TA program, which we have used and just love. Another program of the Office on Violence Against Women. Shireen, any other final comments? No? Okay. Well, we're signing off from Safe Havens, and thank you so much for participating. We hope to see some of you at future webinars. And please don't hesitate to call or email us if you have any questions or suggestions or comments or need any help or support. And we're here to support faith community outreach and training and partnership building, so anything we can do, we're happy to help. So thank you so much, and we will see you all next time.
Thank you, everyone. You'll now be directed to a brief survey about today's event, and if you'd like a certificate of attendance,